Final Fantasy X is a game where you can steal grenades from fish. I know, I don't know why fish are carrying grenades either, but hey. Welcome to a really bad review of Final Fantasy X Remaster. As a bit of a giveaway, Final Fantasy X is the 10th main entry into the series. Not that it matters because up until this point all the games are individual from each other, and we won't mention Final Fantasy X too because it's just terrible. You follow a character that goes by the name of Tidus. Again, it doesn't really matter all that much because no one ever actually says his name during the entire game because for some reason they gave you the option to rename the main protagonist in a fully voiced acted game. It sounds bad, but I promise, this is a quality game. Either that or I was an idiot as a child. So yeah, Goldilocks. This is the main man. Oh wait, just in case. So, you play as Goldilocks as you journey through the world of Spira with your misfit crew of guardians and the mega mashup anime girl stereotype that is Yuna. No, I don't know why she has different coloured eyes. No one really knows. Like a lot of this game, you just accept it for what it is. The story itself was a fairly modern take on a Final Fantasy game at the time, taking religion, race, politics and death into a setting of corruption and mystery as you unfold a magnitude of information from start to finish, and yeah, despite this you never feel overwhelmed or confused. The pacing of the game is nearly perfect and it really helps immerse you as the player and invests into the long-term outcome of the story. You experience a variety of moments in the game, from light-hearted banter to emotional farewells, all presented and wrapped up in a nice little bow for closure. There you go. Also, I was going to address the voice acting because at this stage the infamous laughing scene, which I'm certain is kind of intentionally meant to be bad, is practically a meme. And I've always been a bit butthurt by that because I loved this game as a child, but in all honesty, looking back at it, it's sketchy as fuck. Surprisingly, despite being involved most heavily out of all the characters, James Arnold Taylor, who does the voice of Tidus, actually does a really solid job like 90% of the time. He has a successful career as a voice actor after Final Fantasy X, which, you know, should say a lot about him. Using him to narrate most of the game was also a really nice touch and helped a lot to understand the situation and progression of Tidus as a character. Other mentions also go to whoever plays Aura in the Seymour, but apart from that it's... yeah. Okay, so it's difficult to judge the graphics of a remastered game because if you compare it to the time period that it actually came from, it's going to look like a masterpiece. And if you compare it to something now, it's going to look like garbage, so welcome to this tiny niche of remastered games from the same time period. This tiny niche, you know. It's not often you see games from this period get the remaster treatment. It's so rare that I get to judge this against other remastered games from the PS2 era. It's just unusual. But yeah, in comparison to other remasters from the same generation, it brushes up quite nicely. There are some areas where the remaster has revealed a few flaws that were otherwise covered up by the previous hardware limitations, like this for example. The sky just looks like a sheet of paper, and some of the enemy deaths make them look like glazed donuts, and interactive objects stick out like a sore thumb, which is pretty typical of games for the time. But generally speaking, Square Enix or Squaresoft, depending on, you know, what time period you live in. Yeah, I think it was Squaresoft at the time. Absolutely smash it when it comes to graphics, and Final Fantasy X was no exception. Even when it was first released, the graphics were nothing short of remarkable, and to this day it's probably one of, if not the best looking PS2 game, and with the ability to ramp this up to 1440p with ultra settings on your PC, your experience of the game truly modernises the classic, with completely new menu systems, text and textures. For me, this is the best way to experience the game if you haven't played it yet. Except the lip syncing is the lip syncing is just bad. A mixed bag. There's quite a lot of different systems in place here to go through, so I'll try and burn through them and say what I do and don't like fairly quickly. You've got your classic navigation, walking around and exploring. This hasn't aged well at all. It felt like it was created for a controller that only had 8 different directions as an option, despite the 360 analogs kind of being around for several years at this point. Surely when looking into remastering the game, which you released multiple times across multiple platforms, you could have taken a look at the roaming controls. They feel so clunky and awkward, and it doesn't translate into a good experience. Imagine only being able to move in 8 specific directions in real life. Just the level of the toe stubbing would just increase. I just don't want to think about that. You've also got the dungeons, or in this scenario temples. Generally, I hate shit like this in games, okay? Although I understand it's necessary in RPGs to include stuff like this to kind of lower the repetitiveness and monotony that can be associated with the genre, but I'm far too impatient with puzzle areas. The lower rate of action just doesn't sit well with me. That being said, the temples were mostly a breeze to get through, and you could be lazy or as detailed as you wanted depending on your approach. You could follow the linear path to the goal line or get sidetracked by the distraction spheres to acquire rare items. It was nice of Square to attempt to move away from the classic dungeon approach that RPGs generally have, and there actually being an area in the game that represents this. Long story short, they weren't too difficult and they weren't too long, but they were just challenging enough to make you feel rewarded by completing them, so overall, it's a nice little addition to the game. Moving on, we've also got the Sphere Grid. This replaces the classic leveling up system from all the previous entries into the series, and despite having some varied opinions at the time, it is pretty well received by fans. Instead of aimlessly grinding XP and having the game increase your stats for you, you gain AP to spend on moving yourself around the grid. It has like token-like nodes you can activate with spheres that boost your stats. The remaster has given the grid a bit of a shake up compared to the original. The developers I guess felt this better suits the game now, but you still have the option to use the original Sphere Grid from the first rendition of Final Fantasy X, or the Expert Sphere Grid that removes some of the early kind of game linearity. As much as I enjoyed this approach and it was a fresh idea at the time, call me old fashioned, but I kind of like the classic leveling up system a little bit. It would be nice to see a modern take on that old system now, but just not many games do it. And then finally you've got the battle system, probably the personification of a JRPG battle system. A living, breathing example of the basic idea of turn-based combat. If you wanted to describe a classic battle in this genre to someone that has never bothered trying it out, this is literally the handbook for that. And although on the surface this can appear shallow or boring, it's probably one of my favourite implementations of the classic turn-based system in any Final Fantasy game. Maybe. I think. Probably. If you're going to do turn-based combat, do it properly, right? And Square Enix have nailed it with Final Fantasy X. This is honestly the bread and butter. Do the basics and do them well, and the more complex areas will kind of make the battles more interesting themselves. It makes mowing through countless non-threatening enemies less of a chore, as after a short time you can usually see exactly how many turns it will take before the kind of battle's done with, whilst at the same time you can plan ahead against the more difficult enemies, kind of reading yourself for potential damage. So normally at this point I'd move on to the summary, but this time I just wanted to add a short section of like side notes about the game that either didn't fit into any of the categories I'd covered already, or I just forgotten to bring up at this point of writing the review. Why was this Blitzball game so much more difficult than I remember? There are a ton of early cutscenes that really need to be spread out. This might be the record longest silence in any gameplay. You got this awesome Aeon battle and oh no wait, it's already done. I'm too OP for this. Also, bent fingers. The story and the voice acting and shit. 7 out of 10. Would have been a strong 8, but loses a point for kind of sketchy voice acting in places. You got the graphics, which is 8 out of 10. One of the top games for its time and one of the better remasters from its generation. A few improvements could have just bumped it up, but it's solid. And the gameplay is 7 out of 10. Personally, I think it's brilliant, but it's brilliant for an RPG. It's a genre that generally tends to involve less interaction than others, and while I'm more than happy for a game to play like this, it's not for everyone. It's a good example for its genre and a good starting point for anyone trying to make their first step into an RPG. The Squaresoft Enix effect, or whatever fucking name, the 8 out of 10. The pioneers of RPG console games created one of the top selling PS2 games ever, and with their ability to create jaw-dropping graphics, the Final Fantasy X Remaster is just another quality release from the company. albeit not perfect, but high quality. And overall, it's a 7.5 out of 10. Not much else to say, really. I think I covered everything. So, yeah, thanks for watching or listening to this review. It's been a long time since I've done one of these. I'm busy and life and that. You can follow me on Twitter. I don't tweet a lot, mostly about Arsenal being bad and no context turn memes. Yeah, cool. Subscribe and that. Thanks.